Streaming.
And good afternoon. We're going to try this again. I had a few technical issues. I think they're worked out. Do we have sound, Jeremy?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So it's Monday, January 29th, and it is, it's Monday 29th. And do we have the viewer at the top of the screen? Yes. Okay, so you might want to refresh there. Today, this morning, we interviewed Charles Prestrud, who is an expert on Washington State Ferry issues. He will introduce himself in a few seconds, but we taped this interview. I think it's very helpful in understanding things like what it's going to take to get back. And by the way, let's take a shot of our good friend Norris here. Norris is with us, and we'll also be hanging around for our talk radio in about an hour.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Anyway, we recorded about a 38-minute interview, I think, and our guest explained what it's going to take to get back the Sydney route. Had some interesting insights about what it might, the advantages of possibly looking into getting diesel boats, if that's possible, and if those diesel ferry boats could come sooner, and a lot of other insights. I think it was very helpful, very good interview. So if we're ready, we are going to go to that recorded interview about 3 hours ago. Good afternoon. This is Jeff Noedel, and this is 48th Parallel News at Noon. Is audio going? We're very happy today to be interviewing Charles Prestrud. Say it right?
Close enough.
Close enough. Okay. And he is from the Washington Policy Center. He is the Cole Center for Transportation Director. And why don't you tell us your bio? I could read your bio off the website, but why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
My career in transportation planning started in the late 1980s with community transit up in Snohomish County. I was a transit planner there and eventually became planning manager. Later, around the year 2000, I went to work for the state of Washington, initially with the Office of Community Development down in Olympia, and then with the Washington State Department of Transportation. I worked there for 20 years. The last 4 years were with the Washington State Ferry system.
And what were the years that you were with WSF?
I started in early 2018 and I retired at the end of 2021. It was 4 years.
Okay. So just a little bit of history, if we can start kind of at the beginning. 1951 was the death of the last mosquito of the mosquito fleet. Do you get the same? You know much more about the history of this than I do. When I read about it, I get the idea that maybe the state kind of helped that death happen. As I understand it, the Blackball was having serious labor. I think there was a strike, in fact, and they wanted to raise their fares, and the state said no. Do I have that roughly right?
That's correct. And the Blackball line couldn't afford to take a continuing loss,
right.
So they tied up their ferries and stopped service. And this, of course, was not at all popular with the public. And after, I forget if it was weeks or months, the state stepped in and offered to purchase all of the Blackball system's ferry routes in Washington State.
For about $5 million, right? About $5 million.
Yeah, which seems like nothing now, but that was a significant investment at the time. And we have to remember, too, that most of the Blackball system's ferries were older, almost obsolete ferries that had been brought up from the Bay Area and some even from the Great Lakes, many decades earlier. The Blackball system also moved its operations up to British Columbia, and they took some of their ferries with them. So anyway, the state ended up buying a ferry system here in Washington State in 1951.
So it seems like for about 50 years, things went pretty well. Seems like the state was a pretty good steward of the franchise or the monopoly or whatever you would call it. And the last 20 years, maybe not so much. Is that fair?
Well, the ferry system has had its ups and downs, to be sure, and it has required a very significant state investment over its entire time in operation. It was at its best when it was planning ahead and making the investments both in vessels and in terminals needed to ensure reliability and accommodate what was often growing demand as the state's population grew and cross-sound travel demand increased.
We in the San Juans here, we're based in Friday Harbor, and we have experienced the pain maybe a little bit more than all the other routes. In 2022, we had 37% of the cancellations in the entire system. We had 67% on-time performance. And so I think there's a kind of urgency here, and there's a kind of openness, at least among some people, to explore big ideas on what went wrong and how to fix it. Let me just ask you bluntly: do you think that in some way Washington State Ferries should be privatized, or the franchise should be privatized? In British Columbia, the BC Ferries it's called a state-owned enterprise. Is that something? What's the Washington Policy Center guidance on that?
I don't know that the Washington Policy Center has adopted a position on that specific question. In general, we favor private enterprise because it tends to be run more efficiently and is more responsive to market demand. Now, the Washington State Ferry system was privately operated by private operators, of course, different ones, for many decades before the state took it over in 1951, as we discussed. Going back to a private operation would not be an easy thing to do. There are some legal hurdles that they'd have to get over, and they'd have to find private operators willing to take it on. I think there are some. In fact, a private operator has expressed interest in providing international route from Anacortes to Sydney, BC. That service, as you know, is currently suspended. It was suspended when COVID hit in 2020 and has not resumed since. But it would not be a simple matter, and where ferry systems have been privatized or services provided by private operators, as in Northern Europe, for instance, fares tend to be much higher.
Right. Well, the perception around here is that BC Ferry's customer experience is better. Jeremy last week we spoke to a young man who grew up on Vancouver Island and now owns a business here in Friday Harbor, and he talks about how the BC Ferry experience compares to the Washington State Ferry experience.
BC Ferries, as you point out, is sort of
excuse me. He's going to play a tape here in a second.
Let's see.
I'm going to compare Washington State Ferries and BC Ferries for a second here, but BC Ferries it's a much better experience. Yes, it is a little bit more expensive, but I mean, there's good food on board. It's more comfortable, more spacious. Like, it's just better in every way, other than the fact that it's like $20 more expensive. So, I'm all for privatizing the ferries, even in general, but also on this smaller scale.
Okay, so we just play that as just kind of a man on the street, kind of a typical response. We hear that quite a bit. But would privatization necessarily be going back to the fragmented mosquito fleet approach, or what about the state-owned enterprise concept?
Well, there are other models that could be considered. All of them are going to have to face the basic challenges that the ferry system has now, is the need for very large investment, several $billion in new fleet and terminal upgrades, and the difficulty in recruiting and retaining qualified staff.
It should be, speaking of staff, it should be pointed out that the BC Ferries is having almost as many problems with crewing as we are, and a great number of cancellations and great unhappiness. So privatization would not solve that necessarily. But let me ask you, in these conversations, some of them with policymakers and leaders in the state, partisans, you hear all different kinds of theories on what caused this, and kind of we're trying to lay the fault. And I'm not necessarily looking from a standpoint of blame, but when you look at, when you try to understand policy, the policy changes that are needed, it helps to understand where the accountability is. So maybe we could run down a quick list here. I'm gonna name for you some of the factors or people or organizations that get blamed, and just get your quick reaction to each one. You could say true, false. You could have a different word response. But first, Tim Eyman.
No, he put an initiative on the ballot, almost 20 years ago now, I think, and it passed. It then failed a legal challenge, and that was to the initiative was to repeal the motor vehicle excise tax. So after the court tossed it out, the legislature went ahead and reduced the motor vehicle excise tax. They cut it to $30. It's more in places like the Puget Sound region, where we're also paying for the Sound Transit motor vehicle excise. But I don't think you can blame that one on Tim Eyman. And it was so long ago that the legislature has had many, many opportunities since then to restore funding ferry system.
How long did that period last where the revenue was down from that?
Well, the motor vehicle excise tax largely went away, and I think that was mid-1990s or something like that. And the state has not collected anywhere near the kind of motor vehicle excise tax that it would have had the old formula stayed in effect.
But there have been over 20 years to adjust to that, is your point.
That's right.
Yeah. Another factor or entity that's blamed for this is Vigor. Is that fair to blame Vigor? Or and specifically, let me be more precise. Vigor for not stepping forward and agreeing at a price that was expected to build these new electric boats.
Vigor and the ferry system went through a very lengthy design process for these new hybrid electric ferries. And they then attempted to negotiate a contract for them. And, Vigor was in a strong bargaining position. And I think they also looked at that contract and they said, there's a lot of risk here. This is something new, and costs for everything, skilled labor and materials, have been going up. And they have other clients, the Navy, the Coast Guard, private operators, who would use Vigor's limited shipyard capacity. So I think Vigor, they bid on the high side, and it turned out to be about $400 million per ferry, which was far above the $225 million or so that the ferry system had been hoping that they would get. And at that point, the deal fell apart. So you can blame Vigor for bidding on the high side, but I think there is also needs to be a realization that these hybrid electric ferries are going to be far more expensive, regardless of where they are built, because they are new technology, they are complicated, and they involve some greater risk. That's going to be reflected in bids. That's all there is to it. Another
culprit has been said to be bad luck. Does luck have a role in any of this?
Well, I suppose there is an element of luck in anything, but I don't think blaming luck or bad luck is the solution.
It's not
to
not
the
good
problem.
policy. It's
No.
it's not a good. Yeah, I'm astonished every time I hear references to bad luck. We certainly deserve more from leadership than luck. And I also hear references to magic wands, which I find a little offensive. No one in the public is expecting them to have magic wands, but we are expecting creativity to work, but not luck and not good. We're not, hopefully not depending on good luck and magic wands. Hear a lot of that. Would you say Democrat decisions of the Democrat majority in the last 10 years, 5 years are responsible for this? And particularly, I would talk about the January 16th, 2018 executive order that killed the fifth boat, the Olympic class, or at least postponed it, whatever you want to call it. It instead of being built in 2018, it now looks like it might be delivered in 2028. The way the Climate Commitment Act was designed to focus so much in the future and maybe not so much in the present, what would you say, what degree do you think Democrat decisions made about the time that you were there are part of this?
And I'm reluctant to put this in partisan terms, but you are correct that we had a Democratic governor and Democratic majorities in the state legislature. And the actions they took, I think in many cases unwittingly, resulted in long delays in acquiring new ferries and greatly increasing their costs, as well as incurring additional costs for things like electrification of the terminals so they can recharge the hybrid electric boats when they pull into the slip. And at the time they were making those decisions, they didn't understand, no one did, what the risks were or what the costs were or what the implications were in terms of service reductions for 5, 6, even 10 years as a result of making this transition to hybrid electric.
I think it's very fair, very well put. And I'm not here necessarily to drive any kind of wedges and make this partisan. In fact, I'm kind of myself anti-partisan, but I think it's important to, if we're going to make corrections, to understand, even if they weren't mistakes, we understand how these things went wrong. That's important. On the other side, what about GOP disengagement? The perception in Western Washington that Eastern Washington doesn't care about this. You can't react to that. That's too partisan, but that is something that comes up. I won't even ask you necessarily to respond to that if you don't want to.
Well, I'll give you a partial response. Legislators on the east side of the state, and I've talked to some of them, they are very concerned about the ferry system. Even though there isn't ferry service in their district, as legislators, they see the funding requests that come in and they keep asking themselves, where's the money going and how come it doesn't seem to be solving the problems? But I wouldn't characterize this as just an east side versus west side dilemma. This is a challenging issue for legislators all over the state.
Finally, unions. Unions are often blamed for this. Is that fair?
Not really. The fact is, there just are not a large number of people who have the skills and qualifications of the ferry system. And you can't blame the unions for that. Unions are probably going to drive a hard bargain in the next round of contract negotiation. And they're going to be in a position to do so because ferries can't operate without staff. And there aren't that many people who are willing or able to do those jobs. I will say that another of the governor's executive orders, which was in 2021, I believe, that mandated vaccinations for all state employees, made the situation far, far worse, because there were the ferry system already knew that it was facing a looming crisis of senior staff, senior engineers, captains and mates who were either nearing retirement or already eligible for retirement. And faced with a vaccination mandate, many of them chose to retire, others were dismissed. And the result was the ferry system, in a very short period of time, lost 132 personnel, some of whom were essential for providing the service that the ferry system has in their consumer timetable. And the result, as you up in the San Juans well know, has been service reductions, interruptions, unscheduled cancellations ever since. And it will probably be maybe another year or two before they are fully staffed up and the service is returned to pre-COVID levels.
Do you have any insight into the way Republicans, if for instance there was a Republican governor elected later this year, do you have any insights about what Republicans would do different with Washington State Ferries?
I am reluctant to look into my crystal ball and make a political prediction. Mm-hmm. But I can say that whoever is in office come 2025, they're going to be faced with the same problems. The Republicans, I think, would be more likely, or let's say a new administration, would be more likely to emphasize accountability, and they might attempt to revisit some of the policy decisions that were made by previous administrations.
I have to ask what might happen if the Climate Commitment Act is repealed. Definitely going to be on the ballot now in November. That basically that and the Cap and Invest program is meant to generate $16 billion over the next 15, 16 years, right?
And early indications are it'd probably be more than that.
Even more, right?
Yes.
It's exceeding. If that's repealed, do you expect that will make it harder to correct these problems with Washington State Ferries?
If the Climate Commitment Act is repealed, so that the state is no longer collecting the billions of dollars in carbon emissions auction revenue, does a couple of things. A little of that revenue has been earmarked for purchasing the hybrid electric power systems in the ferries.
Propulsion.
Yeah, that's a small fraction of the total cost of the hybrid electric program, but it is money that would need to come from somewhere else, assuming they go forward with hybrid electric power. The other thing, though, is that the Climate Commitment Act has increased the price of diesel fuel by about 45 or 50 cents a gallon. That's an increased cost that the ferry system pays. About $8 or $9 million a year in additional expenses the ferry system pays. So if the initiative passes and the Climate Commitment Act goes away, it lowers ferry system's fuel bill a little bit, but it reduces the revenue that comes to the state by a lot more. So it will force very difficult decisions for the legislature and whoever our new governor is, as they try and balance the transportation department's budget. It's going to be very challenging.
And here's the big question. This is finally got to it, but the big question that I wanted to talk to you about is something I've seen a few times, and that is the difference of opinion over whether diesel boats could be built more promptly, not to mention more at a lower cost. But could diesel boats, even today, be built faster than the electric boats that we are now being promised for 2027 or 2028? I think they just moved that date back again into 2028. Is there anyone in the world that thinks that that's not going to be moved back again? I have spoken directly to policymakers who say that that is naive thinking, that those could not be built any quicker, any more promptly. And I understand that when that fifth boat that in the style, I guess, of the Suquamish was essentially canceled, at that point, the efficiencies and the scale that was in place to build the previous four boats was kind of given away, and a lot of that would have to be rebuilt. But can you talk about this simple question about if we ordered one or multiple boats in the style of the Suquamish, diesel boats, you believe that those could be delivered more promptly than the electric boats?
That is a very good question. It's one that you would really, to get a definitive answer, you'd need to talk to the shipyards. My sense is that it would probably be a little bit quicker, or at least has the possibility of being quicker, if you go with diesel conventional power. That's a little bit simpler. There's going to be a long lead time either way. It also depends some on whether the shipyards are already booked up, as they often are, a year or several years in advance on other large contracts, for instance, Navy projects and so on. But you are also correct that the timeline for acquiring the hybrid electric boats keeps getting pushed out. And originally they were hoping to have them by early 2027. Now they're talking about 2028. But keep in mind, the design has not even been finalized yet. They have no bids out, no contract in hand. So the bottom line is you're not going to get hybrid electric boats in the next 3 years. Certainly, we're lucky we'll get 1 or 2, 4 years from now. If the ferry system had a diesel-powered design ready to go, and they could find a shipyard that had the capacity right away, under those conditions, you would expect to get a diesel-powered boat in less than 4 years.
So you were at WashDOT, you were on the inside in planning, you know quite a bit about procurement. Would it be the same to just talk to the shipyards in the abstract, or would it be better to just decide to put them out for bid and see what kind of bids come back? In other words, could this be like a theoretical conversation with the shipyards, or would it be best to just put them out for bid? It doesn't require you to build them if the timetable turned out to be the same as the EVs.
The ferry system has issued a request for information. They did that last month, I believe, for the hybrid electric ferry procurement. And that starts a conversation with shipyards. They can submit questions, suggestions, and so on. And based on that, the ferry system will prepare a request for proposals, which is where they really ask the shipyards to make bids. I have suggested to a number of legislators that because we don't know what the outcome of that process is going to be, and there is some reason to think that even rebidding it as they intend, they're still going to end up with very expensive ferries that are not going to be acquired quickly, that it would be nice to have a sort of a fallback position. What's plan B if the price comes in too high or the shipyard can't meet that 2028 delivery time? So having a second procurement ready to go for clean diesel ferries would at least give the legislators something else that they could resort to if the hybrid procurement doesn't play out well.
Let me understand. Is that something that is happening, or is that an idea or a suggestion?
That's just an idea. I don't know of any action being taken by either the ferry system or.
Sounds like a pretty good idea. Yeah. So, second to last question: what do you think the odds are short of significant changes that we talked about in the beginning toward privatization, what do you think the odds are of the Sydney route coming back under the aegis of WSF in 2030?
Well, as you know, the international service to Sydney, BC was initially suspended because the Canadian authorities had closed the border. But two other things happened that have made it extremely difficult for the ferry system to restart that service. The first is you need a special certification for the ferries that provide international service. It's called safety of life at sea. You have to have certain equipment aboard the ferries and things like that. The ferry system only had two ferries that had that certification. One of them was the ferry Elwha, which is quite familiar to those of you up in the San Juans. And as you know, they discovered in 2020, actually 2019, that ferry had significant corrosion. Spent several $1 million trying to repair it, but eventually concluded that it was going to cost too much. The ferry was 50 years old and close to the end of its useful life anyway. So they decommissioned it. This meant that they only had one ferry that had the safety of life at sea certification, and it is sometimes needed on other routes. Plus, it's more than 40 years old too. So the ferry system didn't really have the fleet that it needed to provide that service. And then with the executive order mandating vaccination, they lost some of the crew. So they just didn't have the manpower needed, even if they had a ferry that they could run the service with. Hopefully by 2030, they'll be staffed back up, but they're not going to have another ferry with that safety of life at sea certification anytime soon. Maybe by 2030 if everything goes well.
Finally, in terms of the electric boats and the aspirations involved, I don't know as much about the Washington Policy Center as I ought to, so I'm just going to take a shortcut and ask you direct. Does the Washington Policy Center believe in climate change, that it's real? Is that can we start there?
If you asked around, you'd probably get different opinions. And I don't claim to know. I have smart friends and acquaintances on both sides of this issue, and it's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
It's certainly possible that the climate is changing. It has many times over the many centuries, and it wouldn't surprise me.
So what I'm trying to get at, my last question is there any respect in the Washington Policy Center for the aspirations of Governor Inslee and the Democrats and what they're trying to do of eliminating emissions from the ferries? Is that a noble cause? And perhaps they just did it with a little too much focus on the future and not enough focus on the present? Or is that a cause that you take a dim view of?
Well, here's the way we've looked at it. There's kind of a standard methodology for estimating the cost per ton of CO2 emissions reduced. And that's the yardstick that should be applied to any proposal to reduce greenhouse gas. And if electrification of the ferry system can be done at a good, low cost per ton of CO2 reduced, it might be worth doing. But if the cost is in outer space, very high cost per ton of CO2 reduced, then that isn't the place the state should be spending its money if it's trying to get the most bang for its buck in reducing CO2 emissions. And we simply don't know yet what the cost is. The question came up when I worked at the ferry system, and said at the time they didn't have the data to do the calculation. Well, maybe after we get bids on these new hybrid electric ferries, we'll be able to do that calculation and find out whether it makes any economic sense or not.
Clear answer. Thank you. So, Charles Prestrud, thank you so much for spending some time with us. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I hope our viewers feel the same way. And I hope you can come back sometime soon. It's been a good conversation.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's always interesting to hear what people's concerns are, and we'll look forward to talking in the future.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day. We'll be right back. So that was Charles Prestrud. I thought that was a pretty interesting interview from his standpoint. Do you have any reactions, Mr. Norris?
This is going everywhere on this ferry system. I mean, when you talk about privatizing, electric, diesel, it's everywhere. And, you know, to pinpoint it down into the people that are actually running the ferry and making decisions, do they hear all this is my question.
Well, I don't know what they hear. I can't speak to what they hear, but these are, I tried to raise, the questions I posed are the things that I hear over and over and over here in San Juan County. And the Washington Policy Center is definitely a right-leaning, conservative, private enterprise advocacy group, think tank. So they definitely have points of view, but I actually found a lot of his comments to be extremely reasonable and balanced and diplomatic. But we just, I just asked really a lot of the questions that I hear all the time. And I do think that there's a thinness to a lot of the information that people have. There just isn't that much. And frankly, part of that is the fault of Washington State Ferries. I'm going to use this time here for a few seconds to talk about how important it is for Washington State Ferries and particularly WashDOT, which is over a step above Washington State Ferries, kind of the parent organization, if you will, how important it is for WashDOT to release the 2023 data. We are now almost into the second month of 2024, and the data is there. All the data that they need has been available to them now for a month. And we would like to see the data. What would we do with that data? I don't know. We would just know. It's just the facts, and I think we deserve the facts. San Juan County has definitely paid the price over the last year, and it's a little bit frustrating to know that we may be waiting a long time for that data to be released. The 2022 data, as I mentioned in the discussion that you just saw, in 2022, San Juan County took, could you kill that sound, please?
Oops, sorry.
2022, San Juan County took on 37% of the cancellations in the entire system. Think about that. Over a third were here. The next closest was Vashon, and they had half that. And Vashon the Vashon Chamber of Commerce is very, very good at getting attention and drawing attention to their suffering. But in our case, with the cancellations and the late boats, we also led there too. On-time performance, we had the worst in the entire system, 67%. Only two-thirds of the trips were on time. It's outrageous. And That's 2022 data. All indications are that the 2023 data is worse. Now, I learned last week that the 2022 data, stay with me here, Norris, the 2022 data, which we are looking at today, a year and 13 months old data now, that wasn't published last year until September. WashDOT had that information and did not publish it on the website for 9 months. That's what I was told by a person who knows. I wasn't watching, but I believe this person.
Do they manually track that?
This person knows from the inside when that was published. I've been meaning to go to the Wayback Machine. I don't know if any of our viewers use the Wayback Machine on the internet. You can go back and see maybe what that page looked like in, say, August. Any of you younger people know how to do that? So maybe check and see if that, we can almost determine, depending how often the Wayback Machine scanned that page. Anyway, I don't know, water under the bridge, but
It's not.
it is time. It's been now, we're coming into the second month of the year, and we deserve to see the data for 2023. Why? Because we lived it. We lived through that, and we just, it's kind of like the truth. And it's also, I think, about accountability, you know? It's the truth. It is what it is. Now, we can see in the month of August that tourism visits and tourism dollars took a turn after the disastrous Memorial Day weekend here. We know of businesses that can barely get their employees across the water to service other parts of the county, right?
And there's a lot of them, like Lowe's and Home Depot and other delivery places, that have stopped servicing the island because they have to pay these people for sitting over in Anacortes.
Yeah. So the impact on the tourism industry here, love it or hate it, is consequential. And that means a smaller economy, and that also means lower tax receipts for the county.
Exactly.
So we look at this domino effect, and it kind of comes back to, at least for me, a starting point of the data. So WashDOT should publish that data, and they should not dare take months and months more to publish it.
We had, at the film festival, we did some background check. We had a very not great turnout at our last during October, so we ran some stats from the ferry. And I don't know exactly the number, I'm looking it up, but it was like something like 3,000 less ridership to the island during that same time period.
Right.
So is everybody afraid of the news stories that come out and talk about how, you know, the ferries, and so are they afraid to come here? Are we doing a bad job of PR?
Well, I think the Tourism Bureau made some progress in answering that question, and the answer is yes. Recently, Deborah Hoskinson with the Bureau made a presentation to the town of Friday Harbor and explained just that 70% of the visitors to the San Juans are from Seattle, and Seattle is fully aware of what's been going on here.
But one thing they do note is of the departures, the on-time departures, they say 98% of them, departures and arrivals.
That's system-wide. That's.
Yeah, I know.
We're pulling that average down.
So I know.
We're pulling that average way
40%
down.
maybe.
Our on-time performance in 2022 was 67%. We don't know what it was in 2023. Our number of cancellations, or our percentage of cancellations in 2022 was 37%. We don't know what it was in 2023. I think we have a right to know. That's all. I think we have a right to know. And if the data is sitting there in some staff cubicle in WashDOT, it's time to put it out there. What we do with it, I don't know. It's just the truth. I think we deserve the truth. So anyway.
And they get such negativity. You know, you got to. Every time I get on the ferry, I look at the ferry worker and I go, "Hey, thank you for
Yeah,
being
me
here."
too. Me
Really
too.
do. I think
CNL2 needs to do a bumper sticker that says, I heart, and everybody should put this on their car, I heart WSF ferry workers, and then a subline under that, we know it's not your fault. We know this isn't your fault. And it isn't. And I think it's amazing. I think many people, if they worked in a situation like this and felt the frustration of the customer and occasionally the anger of the customer, I don't know if a lot of people wouldn't show up. A lot of people would quit. So
I think
I really appreciate the people that do the work, and it is not their fault. And we need to, be mindful of that. As frustrating as it can be to sit on the parking lot for an extra 1 or 2 hours, as frustrating. We had an experience a few months ago where the communications on the parking lot level, again, not their fault. It's a matter of how the system is set up and what they're told. But from the time getting into Anacortes, from the time that we got to the booth, the toll booth, to the time that the car parked in lane 1 or 2, it had changed. The timing, the delay had changed, and they hadn't communicated that. It's just incredible, but it is not their fault. These are people doing the best they can with the hand that they're dealt, and I'm very grateful that they're doing it. So thank you very much. Keep coming to work.
Yeah.
Keep the faith. But
Please.
yeah. So
I've heard
please
some of
please don't take it out on the employees. It is not their fault. But the thing about back to the data, and we can see it in this conversation that we just had with this expert, solving the fleet problem, huge, very difficult. Solving the crewing problem, just as huge and just as difficult. Releasing data that you have in your possession, pretty easy, compared to the other two.
Yeah.
So why don't you just do the easy stuff now? So anyway, now we're going to do what we've been trying to do, had some success with lately, is bring the temperature down, get everybody relaxed. So yesterday afternoon, Sunday afternoon, a friend of this show, David Messmer, came in and brought he calls them vibes. I think it's called vibraphone. I call it a xylophone because it looks like a xylophone. David played some songs for us, and Jeremy, are you just about ready to play one of those songs? This is David Messmer, Sunday afternoon, playing the vibes.
This is All Blues by Miles Davis. It's been covered greatly. It's a tune in 6/8. It's not a waltz, but it's in 6, so you get that 3/4 feel.
So that ends the video portion of our show today. We're now going to switch over. We're going to go dark for about 30 to 60 seconds, and then when we come back, this will be CNL2 Talk Radio. So stand by. We'll be back in about 30 to 60 seconds. Thank you.